When we hear about the Middle Ages, images of knightly tournaments, majestic castles, and royal intrigues often come to mind. But all this splendor is only a small part of the story. In fact, most people in that era lived very differently. Their world was limited to the boundaries of their village, and their lives were filled with completely different concerns. We are used to thinking that life in a medieval village was primitive and monotonous, and its inhabitants were ignorant and superstitious. However, modern research and archaeological excavations reveal a much more complex and interesting picture.
Did you hear about the new harvest?
Oh, tell me everything.
They show that the medieval village was not just a cluster of houses, but a complex, well-organized system where everyone knew their place and their role. We will examine the most common misconceptions about life in a medieval village, based on historical facts and evidence. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn how people actually built their homes, cared for themselves and their loved ones, entertained themselves, and managed their households using knowledge and skills that we still consider ingenious today. Social structure and communication in a medieval English village were a complex web of duties, statuses, and relationships. At the top of this hierarchy was the lord of the manor, who owned the land. The peasants living on this land were divided into several groups. The most numerous were the villeins, who were tied to the land and obliged to work for the lord, performing corvée labor and paying taxes. Lower in status were the cotters, who owned smaller plots of land and often worked as hired laborers. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the serfs, who were completely dependent on the lord and had virtually no rights. This system of relations was the basis of the entire rural society. Despite the strict hierarchy, life in the village was full of communication. The church was the center of social life. People gathered here not only for worship, but also to discuss news, resolve disputes, and organize celebrations. The entire community, from the lord to the serf, met here as equals before God. Another important place for socializing was the tavern. Here you could drink ale, listen to travelers' stories, and exchange gossip. It was a place where social barriers were broken down and anyone could freely express their opinion. The village community was closely knit by family ties and neighborly relations. People helped each other with fieldwork, cared for the sick, and supported each other in times of grief. Collective labor, for example, on communal fields, strengthened the sense of unity and interdependence. However, communication was not limited to the village. As mentioned, residents regularly traveled to cities where they interacted with merchants, craftsmen, and townspeople. These were important channels for exchanging information and ideas, which helped the village remain part of the wider world. In addition to trade, cultural exchange took place through traveling minstrels, jugglers, and storytellers who brought entertainment and new stories to the villages. They not only entertained, but also passed on oral traditions, heroic sagas, and news from distant lands. These performances often brought the entire village together, creating a sense of community and shared experience. Village life was filled with rituals and celebrations that brought people together. The changing seasons were marked by special ceremonies, and church holidays such as Christmas and Easter were accompanied by mass festivities. Interaction within the village was based on unwritten rules and traditions that were passed down from generation to generation. Disputes were resolved at village meetings, where the elders and the village head made decisions. It was a kind of local court that ensured order and justice. However, despite all these mechanisms, conflicts were inevitable. They could arise from disputes over land, debts, or personal grievances. Community life required a constant search for compromise and the ability to live in a close-knit circle.
No, it is not.
Now, stop this foolishness.
Economic activity was directly linked to social interaction. Peasants joined together to perform collective work, such as plowing and sowing. Each member of the community played their part, and the well-being of all depended on the labor of each. Gradually, with the development of trade, villages became more open to the outside world. New goods and ideas began to penetrate rural life, changing its way of life. This process was slow but steady, and it eventually led to the destruction of the traditional hierarchical system. Life in a medieval village was a complex, multi-layered phenomenon, where economic, social, and cultural aspects were closely intertwined. Residents were part of a strict hierarchy, but at the same time found ways to communicate and express their individuality. The village was not just a place to survive, but a living organism with its own rules and traditions, where everyone knew their place and their role. What or who, in your opinion, was the most important commodity that the villagers sold at the market in the city? Share your thoughts in the comments. Although the feudal lord owned the land, the peasants had the right to use it, as well as to own their homes, tools, and crops. The peasants paid the feudal lord for the lease of the land, but they were its full users. They could pass it on by inheritance, and no one could take it away from them without good reason.
My lord, we have little to give.
Peasants also had their own gardens, where they grew vegetables and fruits for their own consumption. In addition, peasants had personal property, clothing, dishes, furniture, and tools. All these items were their property, and they could dispose of them as they saw fit. The remains of houses and household items found by archaeologists indicate that people had their own belongings, which they valued and passed down from generation to generation. The right to land was perhaps the most important aspect of a peasant's life. It determined his place in society, his status, and his well-being. Although peasants did not own land in the modern sense, their right to use it was protected by tradition and custom.
One day, all of this will be yours, my son.
It was not just the right to grow crops, but the right to exist. It was the basis for starting a family and passing on inheritance. Unlike modern land deals, which are regulated by complex documents, in medieval villages, this right was passed down from generation to generation and was common knowledge. The work of a peasant was not just a job, it was a way of life. It was closely connected with nature and the changing seasons. A peasant's day began at dawn and ended at sunset. The main tools were the plow, sickle, and scythe, and the main crops were wheat, barley, and oats. Fieldwork often required collective effort, which strengthened the community. Neighbors helped each other with sowing, harvesting, and other heavy work, creating strong social bonds. This collective labor was not only economically efficient, but also brought people together, helping them cope with difficulties. In addition to working on the Lord's fields, peasants had the right to work on their own land. This land was their main source of livelihood. Everything he grew on it belonged to him. This gave the peasant an incentive to work hard, as he knew that his labor would benefit him and his family. However, his work was not limited to agriculture. Peasants often engaged in other crafts. They wove baskets, repaired tools, and made wooden utensils. These skills were not only useful in everyday life, but also allowed peasants to earn extra money by selling their products at the market. The system of corvée, compulsory labor on the Lord's land, and rent, payment in cash or kind, was the basis of economic relations. Corvée could last several days a week and was strictly regulated. In addition, peasants had to pay various fees, for example, for using the Lord's mill, or for the right to graze livestock on communal pastures. These payments were a heavy burden, but they were part of a traditional system that ensured order and stability. At the same time, they restricted the freedom of peasants and their ability to accumulate wealth. Despite all the restrictions, peasants enjoyed a certain degree of economic independence. They could sell their surplus crops or their products at the market, which gave them access to goods they could not produce themselves. This, in turn, contributed to the development of trade and the growth of cities. Gradually, with the growth of commodity money relations, peasants began to pay their taxes in money rather than labor, which made them freer and more independent from their lords. This process was slow but steady and led to the gradual erosion of the feudal system. The right to property and labor in the medieval village were closely linked. They determined not only economic relations but also the social structure of society. Peasants who worked their own land and owned their own tools were an integral part of this system. Their labor was the foundation of the entire society, and their right to property, albeit limited, was the key to their survival. In a world where everything from land contracts to family histories was passed down by word of mouth, how would we learn about our rights? How would we preserve our history without the ability to write it down? We'll talk about this very soon. Contrary to popular belief, the inhabitants of medieval villages were not entirely illiterate. Although literacy rates were low, they were much higher than we tend to think. There were schools in villages where people were taught to read and write. Of course, they were not like modern schools, but they gave people the basic knowledge they needed to run their households and trade. Many peasants could keep records and count. Tablets found by archaeologists with records of debts and transactions show that people used writing in their daily lives. In addition, there were people in villages who were more educated than the rest. These were elders, priests, and scribes who helped people with documents and accounts. Education in medieval villages was closely linked to the church. The church was not only responsible for spiritual life, but was also the center of education and knowledge preservation. Priests were often the only literate people in the village and acted as teachers, passing on basic knowledge of reading, writing, and arithmetic. In some villages, there were small schools attached to churches where children, mainly boys from wealthier families, could receive primary education. These schools provided practical skills necessary for farming and participating in local government. Literacy in the Middle Ages was mainly functional. People learned to read and write not for pleasure or self-improvement, but to solve specific problems. Peasants engaged in trade had to be able to keep track of their goods and debts. Scribes and village elders were indispensable for drawing up contracts, court records, and tax documents. They were a kind of notary and lawyer whose knowledge ensured order and justice in society. For peasants who could not write, these people were a bridge to a wider world where rules and laws existed in written form. Writing also played an important role in everyday life. Archaeological finds such as wax tablets and wooden tags show that peasants used them to keep records of transactions, debts, and family events. These simple records were their personal history, their financial documents, and legal evidence. They were proof that literacy was not the exclusive prerogative of the elite, but was part of the lives of ordinary people. This allows us to rethink our view of medieval peasants as completely illiterate and uneducated people. In addition to the church and rural schools, there were other ways to acquire knowledge. Some peasants could learn to read and write from their more educated neighbors or relatives. Craftsmen, especially those who traded with towns, also needed basic reading and arithmetic skills. Literacy was not only a sign of high status, but also a tool for survival and prosperity. It gave peasants the opportunity to defend their rights, trade, and participate in community life on an equal footing with others. Despite the presence of literate people, the majority of the population remained illiterate. This created certain difficulties. The transmission of information depended on the spoken word, which made it vulnerable to distortion and error. Oral contracts and agreements could be forgotten or interpreted differently, leading to conflicts. In such conditions, the role of literate people in the village was invaluable. They were the keepers of knowledge and intermediaries between the illiterate majority and the written world of the feudal elite. The level of literacy in medieval villages was certainly lower than in cities, but it was sufficient to sustain society. It showed that even under the feudal system, people sought knowledge and used writing in their daily lives. This was not just the ability to read and write, but the ability to survive and thrive in a world that was gradually changing. Although living conditions were far from ideal, people took measures to maintain cleanliness. Villages had public baths where people washed and socialized. Water was available from rivers and wells, and people used it for washing and laundry. Archaeological excavations at former village sites have uncovered the remains of baths and soap made from animal fats and ash. As for clothing, it was washed and dirty clothes were replaced with clean ones. Of course, this was not as frequent as it is today, but it was done. Hygiene habits in medieval villages were determined by the availability of resources and traditions. Although daily showers were impossible, people kept themselves as clean as possible. Washing hands and face was a common practice, especially before meals and after working in the fields. Public baths were an important part of social life, where people not only washed but also exchanged news and gossip. These baths were often simple wooden structures with stone ovens where water was heated, and they were a place for socializing and relaxing after a hard day's work. Primitive soap made from animal fats, such as pork or beef, and wood ash was used for washing. This process was laborious, but the result was effective. Soap not only cleansed the skin, but also helped to combat insects and parasites, which were a common problem in the Middle Ages. In addition to soap, various herbs and infusions with antiseptic and aromatic properties were used to cleanse the body. For example, mint and rosemary were often added to water for washing. Dental care was also part of hygiene, albeit in a primitive form. People used twigs and herbs to clean their teeth and gums. Plants with abrasive properties were particularly valued for their ability to remove plaque and food debris. Despite the lack of modern amenities, people strove to maintain oral hygiene to avoid disease and unpleasant odors. In addition, toothache was one of the most common problems and was treated with herbs, infusions, and even cauterization. Clothing also played an important role in maintaining cleanliness. Peasants wore simple clothes made of linen, hemp, or coarse wool. It was practical and durable, but it had to be washed regularly, which was no easy task. Water from rivers and wells was used for washing, as well as lye obtained from ash. Clothes were washed by hand, beating them on stones or using special boards. Despite all efforts, clothes were rarely perfectly clean, but people tried to keep them in good condition to avoid disease. Personal hygiene was closely linked to health. People intuitively understood that cleanliness helped prevent disease and tried to follow these principles. However, a lack of knowledge about germs and unsanitary living conditions in general limited their efforts. Diseases caused by poor hygiene were common, but people believed that they could be prevented through cleanliness and proper nutrition. Thus, it can be said that medieval people paid attention to hygiene as much as possible under their circumstances. They used the means and methods available to them to keep their bodies, clothes, and homes clean. This was not simply a desire for comfort, but a necessity for survival in a world where disease and unsanitary conditions were a constant threat. Now that we have established that medieval people were not as dirty as we might think, another equally important question arises. What did they eat to avoid smelling like they hadn't washed? Let's talk about that right now. The diet of medieval peasants was quite varied, and they ate many different foods. Grains were the staple of their diet: barley, rye, and oats. These were used to bake bread and make porridge and soups. But besides grains, people actively used other foods as well. They grew cabbage, onions, garlic, beans, and peas in their gardens. Meat was part of the diet, although not every day. People raised pigs, chickens, geese, and cows. Fish was also an important part of the diet, especially during fasting days. In addition, people gathered wild herbs, berries, and mushrooms. Bread was the staple food, often coarsely ground and mixed with bran and even seeds. It was the main source of calories and energy and was eaten with every meal. Bread could be baked in a communal oven, which was the center of village life, or at home if the farmer had his own oven. In addition to bread, grains were used to make porridge and soups, which were simple but nutritious dishes. These dishes were often cooked with vegetables, herbs, and, if lucky, pieces of meat. Vegetables were an important part of the diet because they were easily available and could be grown in one's own garden. Cabbage, onions, garlic, peas, and beans were the most common. They not only added flavor, but were also a source of vitamins and minerals. For example, garlic and onions had antiseptic properties. While beans and peas were an important source of protein, especially on fasting days when meat was forbidden, meat was more of a luxury than a daily dish. Its consumption depended on social status and the season. Pork was the most popular type of meat, as pigs were easy to raise and could feed on scraps. Chickens and geese were also raised, providing not only meat but also eggs. Cows were valued primarily for their milk, butter, and cheese, and meat was only slaughtered in cases of extreme necessity, such as in late autumn to prepare for winter. Meat was often salted or smoked to preserve it for long periods of time. Fish was a vital part of the diet, especially during fasting days when the church forbade the consumption of meat. Peasants living near rivers and lakes caught fish and ate it fresh or dried. In drier areas, people ate salted and dried fish, which was an important commodity in trade. Fishing was not only a means of obtaining food, but also an important occupation for many peasants. Wild foods such as berries, mushrooms, and herbs supplemented the diet, especially in summer and autumn. Gathering these foods was part of everyday life and helped peasants survive in difficult times. Berries were used to make compotes and jams, and herbs were used to make medicines and infusions. This variety of foods made the medieval peasant diet more balanced than we tend to think, and helped them get the nutrients they needed. Beer and ale were the main beverages, as water from rivers and wells was often contaminated. Beer was low in alcohol, even children drank it, and it was an important source of calories. Ale was brewed from barley and was an integral part of every meal. It was a safe and nutritious drink that not only quenched thirst, but was also part of social life. Thus, the diet of medieval peasants was simple but functional. It was based on local products that were available in the village and varied according to the season and religious holidays. Despite all the difficulties, people found ways to provide themselves and their families with the necessary nutrition. They used all available resources and knowledge to survive and thrive. Life in a medieval village was not boring or monotonous. People had many forms of entertainment and knew how to spend their time usefully. Villages held celebrations, fairs, and festivals, which were times for fun and socializing. People played games, danced, and sang. They had their own songs and stories, which they passed down from generation to generation. In addition, there were other forms of entertainment. For example, people played chess, backgammon, and other board games. They also participated in sports such as wrestling, archery, and others. Leisure time in a medieval village was closely tied to the calendar. Religious holidays such as Christmas, Easter, and Shrovetide were the main occasions for mass celebrations.
My love, she walked through fields so green.
On these days, peasants were freed from hard work and gathered together to sing, dance, and participate in theatrical performances based on biblical stories. These holidays brought the community together and helped people forget about the hardships of everyday life. Fairs and festivals were another important part of leisure time. They took place several times a year and attracted people from surrounding villages and towns. Fairs were not only a place for trade, but also for entertainment. Street performers, jugglers, acrobats, and minstrels performed here, bringing news and stories from distant lands. These events were a window to the wider world and helped people broaden their horizons. Games were also a popular way to pass the time. Board games, such as chess and backgammon, were popular among all classes of society, although they were perhaps less sophisticated in villages. Checkers, or mill, and other simple games played on boards drawn on the ground were accessible to everyone. These games developed logic and strategic thinking and served as a good way to socialize. Sport was an integral part of life. Men competed in wrestling and archery, which helped them stay in shape and prepare for possible military conflicts. These competitions were often accompanied by betting and were the subject of heated debates. Football, in its primitive form, was also popular, although it was more like a mass brawl than a modern sport and often ended in injuries. Stories and songs were the main means of transmitting knowledge and traditions. In the evenings, when work was finished, families gathered around the hearth, and elders told legends, myths, and stories about their ancestors.
Cut with the wind, cut with the grain, every stroke a harvest gain.
These stories were not only entertainment, but also a way to preserve history and culture. The songs sung at festivals and in the fields reflected the life, joys, and sorrows of the medieval peasant. Work was also part of leisure, although this may seem strange. Working together, for example, in communal fields or building a house, was often accompanied by songs and jokes. This made hard work easier and more enjoyable, and also strengthened the community spirit. People did not separate work and leisure as strictly as we do today. Thus, life in a medieval village was filled with simple but meaningful entertainment. People found joy in socializing, games, and celebrations, which helped them forget their hardships. These forms of leisure were an integral part of their culture and were important for maintaining the social structure. After all the dancing and fun, who had the right to decide when the party was over? And how much could this eternal spoiler influence the life of every peasant? Stay with us. We'll tell you all about it right now. The feudal lord's power over the peasants was not absolute. Although the feudal lord did have a lot of power, the peasants had their own rights and responsibilities, which were enshrined in law. They could complain about the feudal lord to the court and even take him to court. Peasants were also free to move around and even leave the village if they were dissatisfied with their conditions. Of course, this was not easy, but it was possible. The feudal system was based on the relationship between the lord of the manor, feudal lord, and his peasants. The lord owned the land and gave it to the peasants to use, and in return received their labor, taxes, and loyalty. This was not just a contract, but a complex network of obligations and rights enshrined in traditions and customs. The lord was not only a landowner, but also a judge and protector. He was responsible for maintaining order, resolving disputes, and defending the village from external threats. However, his power was limited by customary law and traditions that were known and respected by all. Although peasants depended on the lord, they were not his slaves. They had certain rights that were protected by law. For example, they had the right to use the land, pass it on to their heirs, and even sell their right to use it. This gave them a certain degree of economic independence. In the event of unfair treatment by the lord, peasants could take him to the manorial court, where their case would be heard. This court was made up of peasants, which gave them the opportunity to influence decisions. It was an important mechanism that protected peasants from arbitrary rule. The manorial court was the heart of self-government in the village. It met regularly to resolve disputes, hear crimes, and keep order. The court dealt with cases involving debts, land disputes, theft, and other offenses.
I demand recompense for the damages to my harvest.
The peasants who sat on the court were familiar with local traditions and customs, which made their decisions fair and understandable to everyone. Although the lord or his representative presided over the court, his power was limited, and he could not make decisions alone. This was an important element that gave the peasants a certain amount of power. Contrary to popular belief, many peasants were not tied to the land. They could leave the village if they wanted to, although it was not easy. To do so, they had to obtain permission from the lord and pay a certain fee. Many moved to the cities, where they sought a better life and became craftsmen or merchants. This process was an important factor in the growth of cities and the development of the economy. It was also a kind of leverage over the lord, who, in order to keep his peasants, had to provide them with acceptable conditions. The church also played an important role in limiting the power of the feudal lord. It protected peasants from arbitrary rule and could speak out on their behalf. Church holidays and customs were part of village life, and the lord could not ignore them. The church was also a major landowner, and many peasants worked for it rather than for the secular feudal lord. This created an alternative that gave peasants more freedom. Thus, the power of the feudal lord in the medieval village was a complex phenomenon. It was based not only on force and land ownership, but also on traditions, customs, and laws. The peasants, although subordinate, had their own rights and duties, which they defended. They could complain about their lord, participate in court proceedings, and even leave the village. All these factors made their lives more complicated than we tend to think, and showed that even under feudalism, people had a certain degree of freedom. The houses of medieval peasants were not just shelters from the weather, but real fortresses, built from available materials and designed to withstand the harsh realities of life. Their architecture reflected not only the climatic conditions, but also the social status of the owner and community traditions. Depending on the region, a wide variety of materials were used for construction. In northern England, where there were many forests, houses were often built from an oak frame filled with wattle and daub. This method was simple and effective. The oak beam frame provided a solid foundation, and the space between the beams was filled with interwoven branches, wattle, which were then coated with a mixture of clay, straw, and manure. This provided good insulation and protection from the wind. In regions with an abundance of stone, such as Scotland and Wales, houses were built from unworked stones held together with clay mortar. A typical peasant house consisted of 1 or 2 rooms. The main room, or hall, was the center of all life. Here, people cooked, ate, slept, and received guests. Simple wooden benches and tables usually stood along the walls. The floor was earthen, covered with the straw or reeds, which were periodically replaced. In the center of the hall was a hearth, which was not only a source of heat, but also the main place for cooking. Smoke from the hearth rose to an opening in the roof or escaped through a small window, although this often made the room smoky. Roofs were one of the most important elements of a house, as they provided protection from rain and snow. They were most often covered with a thick layer of straw or reeds, which provided excellent heat and water insulation. A thatched roof was easy to make and inexpensive, but it had to be replaced regularly as it wore out quickly. Wealthy farmers could afford tiles or wooden shingles, which were more durable but also more expensive. Farm buildings were often located next to the residential house. A barn for livestock, a pigsty, a chicken coop, and a cowshed. All of them were built according to the same principle as the residential house. These buildings were an integral part of the peasant economy and were used to store crops, keep livestock, and protect against the weather. Sometimes the cattle shed was attached to the house, and the heat from the animals helped to warm the living quarters. The architecture of rural houses was not merely functional, it was imbued with symbolism. The house was a symbol of the family and the clan. It was built according to tradition, and every element, from its orientation to the cardinal points to the location of the hearth, had its own meaning. The peasant house was a fortress that protected against the outside world, and a place where knowledge and traditions were passed down from generation to generation. Medieval houses, although simple, were very practical. In northern countries where winters were cold, houses were built of thick logs or stone, which retained heat well. In warmer regions, wood and clay were used, which were also effective. Houses had fireplaces and hearths, which were not only used for cooking, but also for heating the room. Smoke from the fire escaped through special openings in the roof, which helped to prevent suffocation. Medieval peasants were not primitive farmers. In the Middle Ages, important discoveries were made in agriculture that led to increased crop yields and improved people's lives. One of the important discoveries was the plow. It allowed the land to be cultivated more efficiently. People also used a 3-field crop rotation system, which allowed the land to rest and recover. This increased yields and helped prevent famine. The development of agriculture in the Middle Ages was a key factor that led to population growth and the growth of cities. The invention and widespread use of the heavy-wheeled plow was a real revolution. Whereas peasants had previously used light wooden plows that only scratched the surface of the soil, the new plow with an iron plowshare could plow the soil deeply, making it more fertile. This made it possible to cultivate the heavy clay soils of Northern Europe, which had previously been considered unsuitable for agriculture. The 3-field crop rotation system was another ingenious innovation. It replaced the old 2-field system, which was less efficient. Under the 2-field system, half of the land was left fallow each year to restore fertility. In the 3-field system, the field was divided into 3 parts. One was sown with winter crops, such as rye. The second was spring crops, such as oats or beans. And the third was left fallow. This allowed 2/3 of the land to be used instead of 1/2, which significantly increased yields and provided a more varied diet. The use of horses instead of oxen for plowing also played an important role. Horses were faster and stronger than oxen, which allowed large areas of land to be cultivated in less time. The invention of a new harness that did not choke the animal made their use even more efficient. Horses allowed farmers to work faster, freeing up time for other activities. Thus, medieval peasants were not simply primitive farmers. They were part of a dynamic system that was constantly evolving. New technologies and social changes, such as the plow, the three-field system, and horses, allowed them to increase their yields, improve their lives, and prepare the ground for future changes. Medieval people cared about their health. In the Middle Ages, there were doctors who possessed deep knowledge and skills. In villages, there were healers and herbalists who treated people with herbs and other remedies. In cities, there were doctors who were educated at universities. They knew how to treat diseases and perform operations. Healthcare in medieval villages was a complex mix of traditional knowledge, superstition, and limited medical practice. Unlike modern doctors, who rely on scientific methods, medieval healers used knowledge passed down from generation to generation. Healers and herbalists were the main doctors in rural areas. They possessed extensive knowledge of medicinal herbs and their properties. They gathered plants and used them to make decoctions, infusions, and ointments to treat various ailments. Their knowledge was invaluable, as they were the only source of medical care for most of the population. In cities, on the other hand, medical practice was more advanced. Doctors educated at universities such as Paris, Bologna, or Oxford relied on the works of ancient Roman and Greek physicians such as Galen and Hippocrates. They possessed diagnostic skills and could perform complex operations, including amputations and trepanation of the skull. However, their services were only available to wealthy people, and ordinary peasants could not afford them. Medical theories at the time were based on the idea of humors: 4 fluids in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose imbalance was believed to cause disease. Treatment was aimed at restoring this balance. Doctors used bloodletting, cauterization, and diet to return the body to its normal state. Although these methods may seem primitive to us, they were based on centuries of observation and experience. Most diseases were treated with diet, medicinal herbs, and hygiene. People intuitively understood that cleanliness helped prevent disease and tried to maintain it as much as possible.
May your spirit be healed.
However, in the absence of knowledge about germs and unsanitary conditions, even the simplest wounds could lead to serious infections. Therefore, when an illness was too serious, people turned to the church, which was considered the last resort and source of healing. Despite all the limitations, medieval medicine was part of a vibrant and evolving society. The knowledge and skills of doctors and herbalists were passed down from generation to generation, and new discoveries and treatments gradually became part of everyday practice. It was a world where people fought for survival using all the means and knowledge available to them. We have looked at the most popular misconceptions about life in a medieval English village, and found that many of them have nothing to do with reality. Archaeology and historical documents have helped us recreate a more accurate and complete picture of this era. We have learned that people were cleaner, more educated, and more inventive than we thought. What other facts about the Middle Ages would you like to learn? Suggest topics for our future videos in the comments. Also, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our new releases.
What topic shall we delve into next?